Everybody on Zoom, just go ahead and click got it. Don't leave the meeting. Okay, I'm just gonna go everywhere and click OK. Shush your phones. And okay. Right now, I had over 110 homes scheduled to be on Zoom, and right now I have 64.
I should have thought of something to say.
And then here we have, looks like we had about 200 and plus, and Zoom took some of them, which I think worked out really well. And I will keep the air conditioner lowered so it's nice and cool in here, but not too cool. All right, and Dr. Watson promises everybody on Zoom in here is to be loud, but he has to speak into the microphone, and he will not leave this little corner. Okay? And please, we have plenty of cookies for Dr. Watson, so you please eat them. We'll make sure that we get them into go box. Okay, so thank you all for coming tonight. We've had Dr. Watson scheduled for almost a year now, and he's been traveling the world on cruise ships. He's been here at home teaching the kids, and we're excited, when it comes to lectures and what topics. We do realize, and I say it many times, that Dr. Watson could read the yellow pages and we would be entirely happy. So, but this is better. I'm going to go ahead and list everybody. We've been waiting for Dr. Watson for a long time now. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Already got my cookie stash, my cookie friends. Thank you. How's everyone doing? Good to be back. Before I jump into this, a couple of announcements. I want to invite you to come to Lynn University. This is my 32nd year as a professor. Can you believe that? I know, I'm in my 20s, and 32 years. I've been running a distinguished lecture series all along, and I've been running at Lynn for the last 16 years. This last week, we had the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Last year, we had 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. We had an Academy Award-winning filmmaker from Hollywood. We had the general that ran the war in Afghanistan. I hosted a joint town hall between the U.S. House of Representatives and the German Bundestag. That was fun, interesting. A couple presidential candidates. At any rate, we have 2 programs coming up for you that are open to the public. All you have to do is call Lynn University and ask for the box office. Easy. When you get to the box office, just say one of Dr. Watson's programs. The first one is free. I got a large grant, so I was able to cover all the costs. We're doing a program on the art, music, and poetry of the Holocaust. I'm going to talk about the art, show the art, talk about the composers and the music they composed. We're going to play it. And I'm going to talk about the poetry. Our students are going to read it. So we're going to take a look at, it's not just enough to survive. One has to survive and retain the culture and a sense of humanity. So that'll be our focus. It'll be March 1st at 12 o'clock noon at Lynn, and it's free. I also have a traveling exhibit from the Holocaust Museum and a traveling exhibit from Theresienstadt outside of Prague. So I'll have those set up in our library and in the lobby of the theater, and you can walk around and enjoy the exhibits. On March 27th, we have another program, 12 o'clock noon. I'll be interviewing the commander of the International Space Station. He's a really, really cool guy. I'll give you a fun story. His name's Frank Culbertson. I have the great pleasure of having him as a friend. So I called him recently and told him, we have, Lynn University covers all his costs, of course. We have deals with JetBlue and Delta. And I said, Commander Frank, the guy was a combat pilot. He was a test pilot. He's basically Chuck Yeager. He's an astrophysicist. He's Carl Sagan. He was an astronaut, space shuttle commander of the International Space Station. Amazing guy. I said, Commander Frank, don't forget when you get your plane ticket, just send it to me and of course we'll cover it. He says, Robert, I thought we were friends. I said, Commander, I think you misunderstood. Just send me the ticket and I'll take care of it. He said, Robert, you're not listening to me. I thought we were friends. He goes, Robert, I've docked the space shuttle at the International Space Station a half dozen times. You want me to fly Delta? I'm like, oh, bro, we're still friends. So he has an experimental jet he flies all over the world. But, he's a really cool guy, really cool guy. So I'll give you one more. We were talking a couple of months back at an event, and he was the only American in space during 9/11. You've seen that famous photo of the smoke. That was him that took it from the space station. He angled it and got out for the photograph. He was on the commander of one mission. It was him and his Russian cosmonauts. Now, Americans have those suits that you fly around in, right? When you spacewalk, cosmonauts, Russia doesn't have those. They have 2 long bungee cords, and they literally hook them on eyelets, rings outside the space station. So he said, I'm not used to it because I'm used to the jetpack, right? Like the Jetsons or something. He said, I was hooking my bungee cord to the eyelet, and all I did was just just touch it. And with that, I started floating away in space. And he said, you can't swim back, you can't run, you can't do anything. You're just floating away. Well, fortunately, his second bungee cord was attached. But NASA monitors all your biometric data. They can tell when you're peeing or sleeping. So, of course, he's floating away in space. He said in his headset, NASA's yelling, Commander Frank, are you okay? What's going on? He said, I decided that there's certain things they need to know and things they don't need to know. So I took a deep breath and said, just working hard up here, fellas. Just working hard. I told him, I said, Commander Frank, it's a good thing I wasn't on that, because if I was, NASA would have heard, fire! But anyway, so he's alive, he's coming to Lynn. I'd like to invite you to 2 other programs in my free time. I play with a couple of bands in the area. We're doing a free concert on Saturday, the 18th at the Boynton Canyon Amphitheater, 7 o'clock. Straight down, what is it, Lions? Yeah. Saturday, the 18th. And then Wednesday, the 22nd, right around the corner at the Delray Marketplace. There's a young African-American singer. She's a professional singer. She asked if we'd back her. And that'll be on Saturday. And then a young Latina who's a professional singer. We're going to back her on Wednesday. We're going to play everything from rock to pop to blues to jazz to country, you name it. From Tina Turner to The Doors, from B.B. King to Dolly Parton, a little bit of everything. Anyway, so come on out. They're both free. Remember, and so is the Lynn program. With me, you get what you pay for. So as long as I get cookies. All right. So I'm an historian. And as you all probably know, I absolutely love what I do for a living. I can't believe I get paid to do this. But my favorite part of history is the hidden history, the stories we don't know or that we think we know, the story behind the story, right? It takes an enormous amount of research and time, but I love digging up what we know, what we don't know. So in some ways, let's see. Okay, I'm going to try it the old-fashioned way. So on, let's see here. And
Remember I told you this time.
the old-fashioned way. Well, it's not there. Oh, we lost the screen.
No
We'll just go
worries.
ahead and
No
forward it
worries.
to Dr. Tammy's on it. So in some ways, history is not unlike paleontology. So if you're a paleontologist, you study what? Ancient life. T-Rex. And the problem for the T-bones, the problem for a paleontologist is you need to make sense out of how a T-Rex lived. How did it hunt? How did it eat? How did it sleep? How did those little arms, did they pull the covers up, right? How did they mate? That would be very carefully, right? Very carefully. So thanks, Danny. And the problem is, though, all the soft parts of history are gone. We only have the hard parts. The soft parts, we don't know what color T-Rex was because the skin, soft tissue, decomposed. Was T-Rex brown, green? Maybe it had stripes or spots. Don't a lot of apex predators have stripes or spots, especially when they're big? And T-Rex would have trouble, hiding because of the size of them. So maybe they had spots, stripes. Maybe they had feathers. We don't know. The problem is we won't know. We don't know what color their eyes were. We don't know what they sounded like. The throat is a soft tissue. It would have that would decompose as well. Steven Spielberg in Jurassic Park guessed that they sounded like a freight train, right? Sounded good to me, but we don't know. Maybe T-Rex chirped. Wouldn't that be something, right? Who knows? Because all the soft parts of history are gone. We only have the hard parts. So the challenge for a paleontologist is to figure out how T-Rex lived based on only what? A tooth, a claw, and a dried footprint in the Cretaceous mud. A couple hard parts. The last T-Rex walked the earth 66 million years ago, right? So good luck with that. But history is kind of the same. And that is, historians have to make sense of the past and to detect it. Only everybody at our crime scene has been dead 100 or 1,000 years. Good luck with that. And a lot of the soft parts of history are gone. We've lost what? The love letters, the poems, the clothing, the games children played, the musical scores. All these things are gone. All we have left are the hard parts: a castle, a cannon, and a crown. So good luck putting together history. This is why, if you're like me, you love history, but you hated all your history textbooks and classes, because it's just one dry date after another. Because the soft parts, the love letters, poems, recipes, musical scores, the triumphs, the tragedies, that stuff's mostly gone. So historians cherry pick the low-hanging fruit and just talk about a king or a war. And I always was the student who asked what happened in the 50 years between, each war or each king. So the challenge for us is to breathe life into history by digging up all those soft parts of history. This guy, Daniel Borston, doesn't he look like a professor? Yeah, I've been working on that look for years. Daniel Borston's the late, great Librarian of Congress. And he had several rules about history. One of them was that 99% of every book ever written is gone. Decomposed, burned, lost, destroyed on purpose. Think about it. If you take a piece of paper and you go out here behind your pool and you put it in the grass, if we come back in 4 months, it's turned to soil, basically. It decomposes. Now, paper today is processed, chemically treated, right? Imagine a parchment from a couple hundred years ago. You're lucky if that lasted a few days. Plus, today we have Ziploc baggies, air conditioning, museums. Back then, heat, humidity, rain, fingerprints all over. I mean, you're lucky if anything lasted. So most books are gone. If 99% of all books are gone, that means essentially we're working with maybe 1% of the written record, so we probably know 1% of history. Borston also said the other problem is the books that have survived were the ones no one read because they were sitting on some back shelf somewhere. All the books that we liked and read, the spine was broke, the pages were torn out, we marked them up, they lost them. So the books that we have left are the things that nobody read. So how do we write our history? How do we make sense out of history? Photography is relatively recent. So, a nanosecond ago in geological time, historical time, photography is very, very recent. So we don't have photographs from throughout history. We have to rely on paintings. I'm not sure how accurate a lot of paintings are, a lot of photographs are. Think about it. On all of you have what, Match.com or JDate, right? Or Facebook or whatever the hell you have. And don't you use that photo from 1993? So future historians are going to look back and go, my God, everybody was so good looking, right? I mean, they were so youthful and good looking. And your profile on JDate or Match.com says you love romantic walks on the beach, the opera, and French food. When in fact, you like to sit on the couch, watch TV, and fall asleep. You don't write that. So they're going to read and they're going to go, my God, people lived fulfilled lives and were so romantic and they look so good and we're so young. So, because we lie. That's what Match.com and social media is about, right? On the other hand, a lot of people read Twitter and conclude that, there's no intelligent life. We are presidents that can't write a full sentence without verbal agreement, right? My God, they can't spell basic words. So even with spell check, they can't spell it. So this is where we are. So I'm not sure how reliable a lot of things are. What we do have a lot of letters. And fortunately for us in the US, some of the most important Americans ever to live, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, left behind a lot of letters, thousands of letters. And Washington and Jefferson both had a front row seat to the birth of this nation. So that's wonderful. I've read, I think, every single thing Washington's ever written. I've read a lot of Jefferson's, and I think any serious American historian will at some point or another. But there's some problems. Take Washington, for example. Washington died on December 14th, 1799, and left behind thousands of letters. Mrs. W., Martha, lived until May of 1802, so 2.5 years past George. When she passed, a lot of his letters are gone. We don't know, but all historians believe that she burned the letters. It was very common at the time. Number two, Martha was intensely private. She never wanted to be first lady. She never wanted to be in the public eye. So she probably burned the letters to try to recapture some degree of privacy. We know that after George passed, she never again stepped in the room that they shared at Mount Vernon. She took a small anteroom on the top floor. And even though she wanted to be left alone late in life, any veteran that came to visit her, she would get money and give them money, feed them, cook for them. So Martha never wanted to be a public servant, but she worked doggedly out of a sense of duty, just like Melania. So the question we have now is, if a lot of George's letter, yeah, Bonnie, what a public servant. I don't care. Do you? So if a lot of George's letters disappeared, that begs the question, did Martha A, just randomly, willy-nilly burn them? Or B, did she strategically, systematically burn them? That's my guess. So I imagine Martha on a cold winter's morn in Mount Vernon with her signature bonnet, a shawl, sitting in front of the fireplace in whatever the equivalent of the 1800s shoebox was, right? With a bunch of love letters. And she's reading them. And in one letter, George says, "My wife is my worthy companion, a rock, an anchor in the stormy sea." She said, "Oh, we'll save that one." In the next letter, she reads it, and George says, "My sexy neighbor, Sally Carey Fairfax, is so hot," right? When she's out bending over in the garden, oh my God. Martha threw that one in the fireplace. We don't know. That's my guess. The next letter, George says, "I was heroic on the battlefield. I correctly figured out where the enemy was going. We outflanked them, and it was a glorious victory." We'll save that one. The next letter, "I bungled into a trap. I lost a lot of men. My men aren't listening to me. I had a horse shot off from under me." That goes in the fireplace. The answer is we don't know. We just don't know. And we probably never will know. Maybe we're only reading the best of George. I'm a big George fan. I wrote a book on him a year ago, won the International Book of the Year. No, don't applaud. It was easy. It wrote itself. 1,000 sources and 1,000 footnotes, wrote itself. But at any rate, here's the other problem with George's letters. George was poorly traveled, poorly read, poorly educated, maybe never stepped foot in a school. And he was a phonetic speller, which means he would have spelled phonetic with an F. And a couple of people are still with us. So hopefully the Zoomosphere, you're still with us, okay? Everybody's looking up phonetic. So George was not a good writer. He also had a volcanic temper. Some scholars describe George's legendary stoicism as a lifelong struggle to control his temper, which he pretty much did. But George, in the year 1783, that's when we win the Revolutionary War, spring of 1775 until fall of 1783, long war. When George wins, King George in Britain, his nemesis, says that George Washington is the greatest man alive because he took a ragtag band of poorly trained farmers, ill-equipped blacksmiths, and beat the world's greatest military. We will be reading and sing about him and singing his praises for centuries to come. And George says, "Oh my God, all those stupid, misspelled, grammatically incorrect letters out there." So George had a Harvard-educated aide named Tobias Lear, King Lear. And George sends Tobias Lear around Tidewater, Virginia, to all of his neighbors' houses, and then knock on the doors and say, "The general wants his letters back." Then Lear was sent to find the members of the Continental Congress, George's colonels and generals. The general wants all of his letters back. He collected the letters, takes them back to Mount Vernon, and with Lear and Hamilton's assistance, they rewrote them, and then Lear redelivered them. Now, the question raised is, did they do that for one letter, 10%, half? 3/4, all, we don't know. So for instance, when I was working, I've written off and on about George for my whole career, but when I was working on, we're on a first name basis after sharing so much time together, right? So when I was working on the book on George a year or so ago, I literally read everything, and I would get a letter, so I'd have to call the folks at Mount Vernon, at the Library of Congress, or the Virginia Historical Society. That's where a lot of the letters are. I'd say I have a George letter. I need you to tell me, is it the real one or 2.0? And they would say, we don't know. What do you think, Robert? And I go, I don't know. So we both agree that if George looks really good, it's probably 2.0. If he looks human, it's probably the real one. If there's a misspelling, it's probably the real one. But other than that, we don't know. We know how Hamilton wrote, so we can match some of the letters to see if it's Hamilton's verbiage. But even if it was, George would have been standing over his shoulder approving what he wrote. So the answer is, we don't know. So I'm not even sure how reliable Washington's letters are. How many people have been to Monticello? Everybody, okay? On the top right, that's Thomas Jefferson's copy machine he invented. It's at Monticello today on a draftsman's table at about a 45-degree angle. If you look closely, you can see there's two pieces of paper tacked down, connected by a pulley, so two quills. So when Jefferson wrote, the other quill wrote the same thing. So what he would do is he'd have one letter he would mail, the other letter he could keep. One, it's a great form of records keeping, right? So Jefferson was our third president, 1801 to 1809. So if he wanted to figure out what happened, with the State Department in 1804 or 5, he had a letter. Secondly, though, Jefferson, like a lot of politicians, was a megalomaniac. He had an ego that wouldn't fit in this room. So he did not trust that the people he sent the letters to would save and preserve his genius for us to read. He was literally thinking, what are people going to think about me in another couple hundred years? I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow, okay? I got to go back to the office tonight. And so I'm like a couple hours ahead. He was thinking, what are people going to think about him centuries down the road? So what Jefferson would do is he would save a copy of his letters to make sure they were preserved so that we could read about his brilliance. But there's a problem. Jefferson was such a megalomaniac. And by the way, he was very thin-skinned. He was whiny, prissy, pouty. Never liked Jefferson. Those of you that know me know it. I loathe Thomas Jefferson. Brilliant, but oh God. In fact, a couple of years ago, I did a program for C-SPAN. I interviewed 8 or 10 Pulitzer Prize winners. Ron Chernow, David McCullough, all the bigs, Gordon Wood. And I asked them all before the program, who's your favorite founder? Who's your least favorite founder? Least favorite, everybody said, oh, Jefferson. But anyway, so here's what Jefferson would do. He would sometimes change the date of his letters and change from present tense to future tense. So let's say in 1805, the Secretary of State, James Madison, signs a treaty and it works out wonderfully. Jefferson would sit down afterwards and write in future tense. I think if I get Madison to do this, it will work wonderfully, and I think this is how it will turn out. Then he'd write 1804 on the letter and stick it in the archive. And so you read Jefferson, you're like, how in the heck did this guy know the lottery numbers, right? I mean, he knew everything. So Jefferson was brilliant. So what I do is I call the folks at the Virginia Historical Society, the Library of Congress, Monticello, and I say, I've got a Jefferson letter here. I need to know, is it real or is it one that he fudged? And they go, what? We don't know. What do you think, Robert? And I go, I don't know. So if Jefferson looks too good, I assume he fibbed on the date. If not, I assume it's real. The bottom line, we don't know. We don't know. So it's very difficult. Here's a couple stories I've uncovered, little known stories, twists and turns, and fun, intriguing bits and pieces from history. These are my tablespoons poured into the ocean of history. So Sarah Childress Polk, she was the wife of James K. Polk. Who? He was president in the 1840s. So at the beginning of my career, I didn't want to be an historian that wrote about one person, one battle, one event. I mean, a lot of them do. And I thought, oh my God, how boring that is, right? When I finish a book, I'm utterly done with that topic and on to the next one. So I actually made a list of everything I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about Washington, the Revolution, Lincoln, the Civil War, Holocaust, World War II, Truman, check on all those. I wanted to write about presidents and the first ladies, but I was really thinking, one of the things I really love, and a lot of you have suffered through my lectures on this, is the presidency. I love the presidency. So I wanted to try to carve out a bit of a reputation as a presidential historian. The problem for me, which is the good news for all of us, is that the last 40 years have been the golden age of history, right? David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meekum, Gordon Wood, oh my God, right? Ron Chernow, Joe Ellis. I mean, the best of the best ever have been writing. So I'm thinking, this is going to be hard to find something they missed. So I thought long and hard about it, and I came up with a topic, and you're allowed to laugh. I thought, I'm going to write the book on Polk. Yeah, go ahead, laugh. That's the dumbest thing I ever thought, right? It seemed to sound good. Why? Our first 7 presidents are very well-known leaders. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, the other Adams family, right? And Jackson, who's an SOB, right? But then starting with number 8, Marty Van Buren, all the way up to number 15, James Buchanan, we have some of the worst presidents in history, not the worst, but some of the worst presidents in history. You've got Harrison, Tyler, Fillmore, Larry, Moe, and Curley in there, right? Really bad stuff, right? But right in the middle of those is Polk. And historians rank Polk. I have the great good fortune of being one of this. There's about 40 of us to get together every 2 or 3 years and do the rankings. You read them in the newspapers. Polk's rated about a B. About a B. He's the president who won what we now call the Mexican-American War. He's the president that signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically allowed the U.S. to steal the entire Southwest. He was a manifest destiny expansionist, bigot, slaver, but that's what the United States loves. So he was a very popular president. He was elected in his 40s, serves only 1 term, could have easily been reelected, but get this, says, I'm just going to step down. Politicians don't do that anymore. So he stepped down, but the public loved him so much, they asked him to take a victory lap around the country and just wave. So he hops on a boat and starts up the Mississippi, catches a disease and dies right away. So it's Shakespearean. So I thought that's going to be a good book. Problem is, as I researched Polk, something happened. I didn't like him. And I didn't want to spend a year or 2 with someone I don't like, right? That's called marriage. So I figured, at any rate, so I figured I'm working on Polk, but I did find something that intrigued me. You don't just read the last of a president or a leader's speeches, letters, whatever. You read each draft to see how they change. For example, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in, right? But in front of FDR, it said history. And FDR added infamy. That's a nice upgrade, right? That's Shakespearean, that's wordsmithery, right? Truman, the proclamation, May 14th, 1948, sitting on his desk was, the United States hereby recognizes the de facto Jewish state. Truman crosses it out and writes Israel across the paper. So you can read into that, right? So I'm reading Polk's speeches, and in the margins is all this scribble. Pause here for a fact. Take this out. Senator so-and-so won't vote for this. You didn't read the article I clipped for you. And I'm thinking, my God, did he have a good speechwriter? And there was no such thing as speechwriters back then. So I got to find out who this guy was. I matched handwriting. It was Mrs. Polk. In the 1840s, here's the short story. 100 years before my favorite first lady, Eleanor, we had a proto-Eleanor. Yet nobody knows anything about Mrs. Polk, and she was seen as a dowdy, head-to-toe black-wearing funny dud that no one liked. She was actually a dynamo. What I found was I read letters, diaries of senators' wives, ambassadors, and what they would say was whenever anybody went to the White House, or if the Polks went to a social, a dinner, anywhere in public, wherever they went, people would stand up and yell, "Ladies and gentlemen, the president and Mr. Polk." So to give you some sense, there was a popular saying at the time, and it went like this: Mrs. Polk is certainly a master of herself, and we all suspect of someone else too. So Mrs. Polk was something else. She was political. The pen that Polk signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with, she had encased in gold, put on a chain, and wore it as a necklace. That's political. So this is Mrs. Polk. In the 1840s, speak slower, okay? Okay. More monosyllabic words. Mrs. Polk, good. Reputation bad. Mr. Polk, who? History, good. Okay, there we go. All right, now this is a sharp audience. All right, I haven't slept in days, so when I don't sleep much, I speak quickly. So I got it. Sorry out there in the Zoomosphere. Women did not go to Washington with their husbands back then. Of course, it's hundreds of miles, open carriage, no GPS. Washington, D.C. was not the city it is today. It was a cultural backwater. Many members of Congress back then used to board at a boarding house / brothel. So you can see Congress hasn't changed all that much. So Mrs. Polk was one of the few wives who went with their husband to every session of Congress. Now, what I found was a couple of things. Women hated Mrs. Polk. I liked her. So I stopped my work on Polk, never wrote that book. She inspired me to write a book on the First Ladies, which I did, but did well for me 20, 30 years ago whenever I wrote it. So I liked her, and no one liked her. So I wanted to solve that puzzle. Why did everybody dislike her? I really liked her. She was that wonderful. So here's two examples. One, the practice of a social calling card, like a business card with a frilly signature, and you would give somebody your card. And a custom in the 1840s in Washington, which I found out, was that if I give you my calling card, you have about 3 days to return the social call. Otherwise, it's a faux pas. Well, guess who never returned the calls? Because she's too busy meeting with ambassadors and generals. She's sitting in every session of Congress and she's lobbying people. So she never returned the calls. That's why women didn't like her. Here's another example. If you go to the White House for a gala, dinner, whatever, afterward, historically, the men would go to one room for bourbon, cigars, and to solve the problems of the day. The women would go to the yellow room or red room for tea and scones and talk of child rearing. I'll let you guess which room Mrs. Polk went to. So the women felt snubbed. So here we had an Eleanor Roosevelt in a day and age where nobody would give women credit for anything. So Polk is a B president. Part of that is thanks to his wife. War of 1812. You're allowed to laugh again. I actually wrote a book on the War of 1812. And an exciting social life, right, Karen? I mean, woo, Dr. Watson hanging from the chandeliers, doing research on the War of 1812. What year did it start? 1812. Good. My students are like 1811. We only do multiple choice in Florida. So just make sure I'm not offending you. Because I can't teach the Holocaust, the civil rights, the genocide, right? Because that would offend someone. We don't want to teach that. Don't want to teach the Holocaust. So in Florida anymore. So of course you know what I'm teaching. I'll be fired before I change it. So War of 1812. So I always wanted to write a book on the War of 1812 because it's a harebrained war. It's like the Keystone Cops were running it. Harry Truman called it, quote unquote, the silliest damn war we ever fought. And nobody knows anything about it. So for those reasons, I wanted to write a book. Also, nobody knows anything about it because we don't put it in the textbooks. Why? Because the Canadians kicked our ass. We tried to invade Canada. We were the belligerent. Also, Southerners wanted to expand slavery into the Southwest, Mexico, Cuba, and maybe even Brazil. And the South was using the war as a cover to expand slavery all over that Western hemisphere. So we don't want to put that in the books, and that's pretty bad. And thirdly, Southerners, it's always Southerners that start all these things, by the way. It's one thing I've learned in history. Every single problem, war, always. Southerners wanted to exterminate the indigenous population. They wanted to commit genocide on the American Indian. The war would give them cover to do it. So that was the impetus behind the war and a couple of other things like impressment, but a couple of other things. So Also, there are a few battles in the War of 1812 we simply don't know who won. So for a nerd like me, I'm like, man, I got to write that book. I'm going to be the guy that finds out who won that battle. And I hope you can appreciate for someone like me, it's pretty exciting, right? And I have a literary agent, his name is Peter Bernstein. And Peter's like, don't write a book on this. What are you thinking? It won't sell. I'm like, I got to write it. Eventually, I'm like, Peter, I'm not listening to you, I'm writing a book. And it was my first book that won a National Book Award. And I called him, I'm like, Peter, guess what? He goes, yeah. How did it sell? Like it didn't, but it got critical acclaim. It's like my point. So I now listen to it. At any rate, so I'm doing my research, and lo and behold, I find a British general's war reports. And it's from rural Canada in 1813. And he wrote who won the battle and the details of the battle. I'm like dancing around the room. I can't wait to write the book. And he writes, it was a great and glorious victory. We killed 500 Americans, only lost 50 men. I'm like, oh my God, now we know. A couple months later, I stumble upon the American general's report, who said, we whooped the British. We killed 500 of them, only lost 50 guys. They're both claiming the same thing, which means someone lied. My theory, they both lied. So here you go. Work with me now. Let's say you're a British general in rural Canada, the hinterlands in 1813. Your army is made up of half-literate carpenters and illiterate farmers, and nobody has anything to write with or on, and many are going to die. You walk into a trap, you walk your enemy into an ambush, you lose, and you write down, I blew it, my men were slaughtered, I should have known better, and you give it to your aide. Your aide puts it in a letter in a satchel, gets on a horse, and rides across Canada without GPS, hoping that a grizzly bear doesn't eat him, an Indian doesn't shoot him with an arrow, he falls off a ravine into a river and freezes, and he may or may not, weeks later, make it to Halifax, where he waits for a wooden ship. He gets on board the ship and sails across the ocean, hoping it doesn't sink. He gets to Portsmouth or Southampton, he has to wait for a carriage. He takes that rickety carriage all the way to London. 4 months later, he has an audience with the monarch, and he gives them the letter. And they look at it and write, you're fired, and hand it back to him. He puts it in a satchel. He takes a carriage all the way back to Southampton. He waits for a wooden boat, sails across the ocean, hoping it doesn't sink. He gets to Halifax, has to buy a horse, has to ride across Canada, hoping a grizzly bear doesn't eat him, then gets shot by an Indian, fall off a ravine. And how do you find a general? We didn't have text messages. General in Canada, how do you find the general? A couple of years later, he meets the general and hands him a letter. The general opens it up and says, you're fired. So what I think most generals did in history is they claimed it was a great victory because nobody's going to write anything down. And if one of the soldiers contradicts what you wrote down, chances are nobody's ever going to read what the soldier wrote, and it'll disintegrate or burn in a cabin that catches fire a year later. And if it's between the general and a half-literate private, we're going to repeat the general's version of it. So I think they all made this up because they could get away with it, unless 200 years later, some nerdy historian does their homework. So a lot of battles in history, and let me just say, I applaud those who serve in uniform. The stories from Normandy and D-Day, and if you want to join me, not this June, but next June, we're doing a cruise for the 80th anniversary of Normandy, and I'm going to walk the beaches and tell you more stories than you ever wanted to hear. Azamara, 600 people, luxurious little ship. We're going to spend 2 days in Normandy. We're going to Mont Saint-Michel, Bruges, Amsterdam, Bordeaux. You can join me on a wine tour where we have to be wheeled back into the ship. Anyways, so the stories from Normandy, I am genuinely inspired by what those men did. Gettysburg, 1863, 3 days in early July, 51,200 casualties in 3 days, and they kept fighting. This is heroic. Yet, a lot of battles in history seem absolutely implausible. King Leonidas in 300 against the Persians at Thermopylae, right? 300 of Leonidas's Greeks held off 1 million Persians. And in the movie version, every Greek has a six-pack. Baklava and six-packs don't go together, right? Well, it sounds a little crazy that 300 people held off 1 million. Why? Because they didn't. How reliable are these stories? The answer, I'm not sure. I'm not sure they're reliable. I have to talk about Harry. Anybody know that I like Harry Truman? I know he's my favorite. It's so bad. I'm at Publix or at Whole Foods or I'm getting gas and people yell, "Hey, Truman!" My kids are like that, really. So Harry, when I was a kid, my dad sent me to work on a farm from 5th grade to 12th grade, 6 days a week, 7 to 3. Hell of a childhood. Made me tough though. But I had a pith helmet, like Harry. Harry did not use Camp David for his retreat. Eisenhower named the Camp David after his grandson David, his granddaughter Susan at the Shaft. It used to be called Camp Shangri-La. That's what FDR called it. So Truman used Key West. How many folks have been to the little White House in Key West? Yay! So one of my favorite places on planet Earth. So I've been on their board for 25 plus years. I do a lot of pro bono work for them. So years ago, around 2000, I was moving to Florida. And the Truman home down there had a new director, Bob Walls. The Truman Presidential Library had a new director, Dr. Mike Devine. The Truman Foundation had a new director, Kathy Knotts. So I called them all and I said, this little White House is a national treasure. And because it's in Florida, it's a dump. Because Florida does a lousy job with historic preservation. Love St. Augustine, but there's McDonald's and billboards next to the oldest school in town. It's Florida, right? And you should see what our leaders now are doing. Answer, nothing about historic preservation. We don't have it anymore. So I said, we need to save this house. Truman spent 175 days there for 11 official visits during his presidency. Went back 5 times. Met with members of Congress, Supreme Court judges, world leaders there. Made important decisions there. Eisenhower was there. Carter, Kennedy, Clinton, Colin Powell did a peace summit there. Thomas Edison stayed there when he was doing depth charge experiments for the US Navy. This is an important home. It was the Naval Commandant's home, but it's a dump. So what happened was, after Truman's presidency, the Navy didn't need it anymore, so they scaled back the naval base there and sold the home. A guy from India bought it and sold all the priceless items inside. I know, right? What a loss. So one of the things we did is I said, we need to track everything down and get it back and put it back in the home. And we have to work with the National Archives. We fortunately, they found everything in Mar-a-Lago. So we were able to bring it back. Put it in, the little White House. Here's one of the problems though. We stole black and white pictures of the carpet and wallpaper, but the company had gone out of business long before color photography. So we did not know what color the wallpaper and the carpet was. So what I did is that it was wonderful. I rounded up, raised $40,000, rounded up every living advisor to Truman who used to go down there, flew them all down there and spent 3 days with them. And I said, gentlemen, your mission is to tell me what color the carpet and wallpaper was. Now, I remember our home when I was a kid vividly. We had this horrible red and black round carpet, right? With these big quilts hanging over it. I remember where every piece of furniture was. I remember the little television. I had to hold the rabbit ears for my dad, right? And then when I would sit down, he'd kick the chair and I'd have to go and stand and hold the rabbit ears, right? So I remember, so these guys remembered the color. And they remembered where his poker table was. And then the National Archives found it. And today it's sitting where it belonged. His desk, we had his briefcase. So I put it on top of his desk so everybody could see it. And one of the senior Truman aides, George Elsey, E-L-S-E-Y, he says, absolutely not. Truman was a military man, not go on the desk. I said, well, where did you put it? On the right side. So I put it there. I said, here? He said, yes. So I looked at the staff and said, never move it. It's there today. So we renovated the White House, the little White House. But I had a surprise for them. Apropos to, okay, boys, it's time to get some work done. So the director of the little White House, Bob Walls, finds boxes in the attic. We were one hurricane away from losing them, that had a list of what Truman was doing Every hour, 24 hours a day, every day he was down there, 175 days. You can appreciate what a treasure this is for the president. What happened was the naval commandant knew the president was staying in his house. So he got a young naval aide assigned to Truman, slept outside his room and said, you write down every hour what he's doing. 3 a.m. sleeping, 4 a.m. sleeping. You write it down. If he wants orange juice, you get it. If he wants shoes, you get it. So this was this treasure trove. So we found this. We went through it. It's now digitized. It's released to the public. It's in the archives. But at the end of the 3-day weekend, I told the aides I had a surprise for it. I told them what we found. And they were thrilled. And they said, well, what'd you find out, Robert? I said, my God, Truman worked his butt off. And they said in Washington, D.C., he almost worked himself to death. Down here, now he just drank and goofed. I said, no, he didn't. He worked his tail off. They said, no, he didn't. I said, yes, he did. I said, for example, let me read for you. Monday morning at 8, okay, boys, time to get some work done, the president says. Tuesday late at night, okay, boys, time to get some work done. On the weekend, okay, boys, time to get some work done. Get up early Sunday morning because, boys, it's time to get some work done. I'm like, this guy worked his ass off. And they all start laughing. They say that young naval aide, when Truman and they all arrive in the little White House, palm trees, and now there's development. At the time, the beach went right up to the little White House. They filled that in, and now it's condos. Florida. At any rate, so what they said was when Truman and his aides arrived the first time, Truman's like, look at this. He goes, let's get drunk and cheat at poker. And the aide goes, Mr. President, I can't write that down. Typical Truman, write it down. That's what I'm going to do. The aide said, Mr. President, I can't write that the president's drinking already and playing poker. Truman said, it's what I do. Write it down. The aide said, Mr. President, Truman says, for God's sakes, then don't write anything down. He says, no, my commander said I have to write it down. Truman says, write whatever you want. So he wrote, okay, boys, it's time to get some work done. Whenever Truman was goofing, drinking, playing poker, sleeping in too late, the aide wrote, boys, it's time to get some work done. So I was prepared to write this article about how hard Truman worked. We found out it was code. I profess myself a votary to love. Gentlemen, I'm going to give you a line now. So you want, gentlemen, you may want to take notes. I got to give it. This is from George Washington. So this comes from the French and Indian War, right? Which was the British and Americans against the French and Indians. That's the title. In Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War because it lasted 7 years, 1750s and 1760s. George is a young man, early 20s, eager to be a hero and a great man, and he's an aide. So he's not an officer, he's a colonial aide. He's assigned to General Lord Braddock. And Braddock marches a massive British army, the present day about Pittsburgh, to fight the French and Indians. And Braddock marches his army into an ambush, and they're slaughtered. 50% of the army, one of the worst defeats in the history of this continent. Every single officer is dead or dying. George Washington becomes George at this moment. We have multiple accounts from men who all say he saved our lives, and they wrote it down. So historians are in wide agreement about what happened at this battle. George runs and jumps on a horse. Washington was the greatest horseman of his time. Young men during the Revolution would say the general can stay on a horse longer than men half his age. Washington could jump off a horse and not fall, run and jump on a running horse. He could do all the trick stuff, like some Buffalo Bill show or something. He could fire a gun and fight with a sword on the back of a horse. This is how I ride horses. So he was quite a horseman. Plus, he was a heck of an athlete. Remember, men were a lot smaller back then than they are today. George Washington was Shaquille O'Neal. He was a monstrous man, size 13 shoes, broad shoulders, enormous hands, and many people wrote when they met him that his physical power was just sucked all the air out of the room. We have 2 doctors' reports that measured and weighed Washington from a Dr. Craig, a Scottish physician. In one report, Washington's 6'1", and the other report is 6'3". So as historians, how tall was Washington? 6'2", absolutely. That's what we said. So a jacket, a shoe, some of his clothes. I'm a little over 6'2", I'm 230 because I had a cruise. I'm the exact size as George Washington. I'm a little bigger than an average person today, but Washington was a monster. And just today, he'd be a hell of a tight end or a power forward. The guy was a beast. Washington jumps on a horse. He rides between the French and Indians and the British with his sword, drawing their fire, yelling out orders for the army on how to get in formation and how to retreat. His horse is shot, goes down, gets up and runs and jumps on another horse and continues to do this. I'm reminded of Kevin Costner at the beginning of Dances with Wolves, right? When I first saw that movie, I'm like, oh my God, that's Washington from Braddock's campaign, that kind of stuff. One of the aides, all the officers are dead, his horse is shot and it falls on him. Unlike the Hollywood movies where you get out from under a horse, you can't lift up a horse. He's stuck under the horse and an Indian comes up with a tomahawk, ready to bury it in his head. Washington rides by and jumps off and crushes the Indian, runs and jumps on another horse. He's Rambo, only he's Rio and Stallone's about, right? So the people are just blown away with George. This is when the legend is born. George displayed suicidal bravery on the battlefield. Right before this battle, he met Martha Dandridge Custis, soon to be Martha Washington. And he writes her a letter explaining his suicidal bravery. Here's the line for the gentleman. In the letter, all the quotes are verbatim. I always memorize quotes. Washington writes and says, "For if I had died, it would matter not, because I would die a hero in your eyes. I profess myself a votary to love." That's not bad. In fact, that's damn good, right? I don't think I haven't tried it. A votary to love. At any rate, the problem, we no longer write that in our history books. I printed my books. Why? Because George didn't write it to Martha. He wrote it to her. That's Sally Carey Fairfax, that sexy, hot neighbor. That's who he wrote it to. Whoops. What this was a fourth quarter Hail Mary. George is going to get married to Martha. He figured he'd give one last shot. Ooh. Sally was married to Lord Fairfax, Fairfax County. The Careys and the Fairfaxes were the political dynasty of the time. It was one last shot. George and Sally had an interesting relationship. She was older than him, as was Martha. George was always looking for an older, wealthy woman. And again, could you see him in Boca today? Maybe Aventura. Lights out. Meisner Park. Good thing the Countess is no longer around. She would have been. At any rate, so George and Sally had an interesting relationship. Lord Fairfax was their neighbor, and of course, he had a mansion, Belvoir. And Lord Fairfax hires George to be the surveyor at age 17 of Culpeper County, Virginia. It's his first job. Then he hires George to be his surveyor and his gopher. And he also tended Sally's garden, and there's a punchline there for Sally, right? She had extensive garden. Lord Fairfax was a little round guy who was never home, and then there's George. And Sally was smitten. I mean, don't forget, George is basically Clooney meets The Rock. Right? And Sally's, I don't know, Beyonce meets J-Lo or something, right? And Sally would sit George beside her at her public events. She was the premier salonista of the time, the who's who, the creme de la creme of the colonies, from Philadelphia, Williamsburg, from Gleneagles, all came to her events. And there she taught George how to dance. She introduced him to literature, and she taught him how to bow, how to curtsy. If you're George, you can't go like this. So she taught George a different way, like a gentleman. He would take off his tricorn hat with his right hand, put it under his left arm, drop the left foot back, rock up, and then come down with a swoop of his arm. So he meets someone and go, right? He loved to dance, and he danced the night away all the time with the ladies. In fact, in Barbados, he was out dancing with the ladies. Only trip abroad, by the way. At age 19, he spent 6 weeks in Bridgetown, Barbados. Went dancing with the local girls all night, caught something. As I wrote in one book, Washington enjoyed the tropical fruits of the West Indies. And we'll leave it at that. So Sally and George had this, he was head over heels about it. The Fairfaxes are loyalists, royalists, that is the Pearl Crown. So when the revolution starts, they go back to Britain, and George and Sally never see one another again. Lord Fairfax and Sally asked George to auction their mansion at Belvoir. And he did, and he sold everything and sent everything on a ship back to them. All the money. He kept for himself one item from the auction, Sally's silk bedroom pillow, which he carried with him throughout the Revolutionary War. I'm sure when Martha visited camp, she's like, George, can we put that under the bed? George lives 2 years after his presidency. 1 year after his presidency, 1 year before his death, he writes the longest letter of his life to Sally. And he writes that I cannot ride by Belvoir without shedding a tear and remembering with fondness and warmth the happiest days of my life in your company, what may have been. And he just goes on gushing. Now, we don't know if Sally answered it or not. My guess would be she did, because Lord Fairfax was older than her and passed away long before. She was a wealthy widow living in Bath, the resort town. And my guess is she probably wrote back, but my guess is that that's one of the letters Martha burned. But we do have a letter from the time. Sally was kind of a Dear Abby, Dear Ann Landis, which my students would go, who? And that was this. Let's say you're a debutante in Britain, and you have an earl and a duke courting you, and you don't know which one to marry. If it's custom, you would go visit Sally, and she knew everybody's biz and knew what to do. So everybody, she was Grand Central Station with the Bowson, right? So we have a young woman, she's a grand niece or great niece, whatever the title was, to Sally, and she's got 3 lords courting her. So she writes to Sally and goes to visit Sally. Sally writes a letter back around this time. And in the letter, she says, don't marry any of them. She goes, I learned long ago, it's not the little man with titles, it's the big man with the big hands. A man who forges his destiny, who creates nations, a man who it's like, lie down on the couch, Sally, it's going to be okay. She just goes on and on about George. So what might have been? I think I've only got 2 more and then we'll call it. So George Washington cut down the cherry tree, right, everybody? How many of you learned this in kindergarten or 1st grade? Everybody. I did. My son and daughter did. My son is like a mini-me, loves history, gets all excited and whacked about it. And I remember when he was in either kindergarten or 1st grade, he came home and he's all excited. I picked him up at school. He's like, Dad. I'm like, what's up, bud? He's like, guess what the teacher said to me? I'm like, what? He said, she said that George Washington cut down the cherry tree. I said, well, what did you say, buddy? He said, I told her she was wrong. I'm like, time for a PTA meeting. So here's the story you were taught incorrectly. That's Augustine Washington, George's father, in real life. And Augustine passes when George is about this age. And Augustine had a fruit farm and he bought George an axe. If you buy your grandson an axe, you get a visit from the Department of Children and Families and your news at 11. George hacks one of the cherry trees. Augustine goes out and he says, quote unquote, in the story, George, who killed my cherry tree? And what does George answer? I cannot tell a lie, Father. And Augustine says, well, that's okay, because in telling me the truth, you repaid me 1,000-fold over what that fruit. Now, if my son cut down a cherry tree, I wouldn't care. If he looked at me and said, Father, for I cannot tell a lie, I'd be worried as hell. Think about the precocious little bugger. But that never happened. Here's what really happened. So a preacher turned bookseller by the name of Parson Mason Locke Weems, W-E-E-M-S. He wants to monetize George's death. So he gets in a story and to write a book about George. Problem is we didn't have Amazon.com back then. Half the country's illiterate. Everybody's still broke from the revolution. So this historian writes a book this thick, no pictures. People can't read. It's expensive. And you put it in a wagon in the spring of 1800. You ride up and down the East Coast. It doesn't sell. He loses everything, Parson Weems. So Weems goes back to Philadelphia and says, I'm going to rewrite it and make it all up myself. And he did, and it sold like hotcakes. This is where we get the stories of George throwing coins across the river. Doesn't he throw them over mountains? He's Paul Bunyan. George has to pee, and it's the Mississippi River. And he falls down, and it's the Grand Canyon. I mean, it was Paul Bunyan. And the 5th edition of the book, around 1803, Weems wants a bedtime story, kind of a moral vignette. He liked Aesop's fables, the story of the lion with the thorn and the little mouse pulls the thorn out, right? He wanted something that parents could tell their kids. So he made up George Washington never told a lie. And for generations, we've been telling our kids that stuff. So let's do one more. Okay, we'll do one more. That's James Buchanan. He was our 15th president, a Democrat from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1857 to 61. As I mentioned earlier, I have the great good fortune of being one of the historians they ask every couple of years to do the rankings. And in all my polls, except the recent one, I always put him dead last. Now I put him second to last. As did every other historian. Chernow, Gordon Wood, John Meekum, Doris Kearns, all of them. So he's second to worst. But anyways, James Buchanan also is the only president never to marry. Never to marry. Grover Cleveland entered a bachelor. He was our 22nd president and our 24th. There was a snafu at the Electoral College. Only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms until Trump gets reelected. So Cleveland married while he was in office. So this is the only lifelong bachelor. However, he was engaged to this woman. That's Ann Coleman. And there's a really touching story. My love is in the grave. And here's the story. So Buchanan and Ann are engaged. Ann's friends catch Buchanan in some hanky-panky. She was so outraged, she called off the wedding. And she and her mother get in a carriage and ride to Philadelphia. Yay! They went to see Karen's great-grandparents, right? So they went to Philadelphia, and there, Ann's favorite sister was living. She wants to cheer Ann up. She said, I have tickets to go to the theater. Ann's too depressed, says go without me. So the mom and sister go. They come home and they find Ann dead of an accidental overdose. Laudanum, tea and an opiate, right? Which was prescribed by doctors back then. Thank goodness for the AMA. So they take her back to Lancaster, and in her wedding gown, she's buried on the day she was supposed to be married. And James Buchanan goes to the gravesite and he announces to everybody, I will never love again. I will never marry, for my love is in the grave. So throughout his life, he never courted, kissed, danced with, dated, whatever, a woman, but nobody said anything because of that story. The problem is the story's bullshit. He made it up as cover because he was gay. So here's the real, would you like to hear the real story? The real story, Ann's friends, Buchanan was engaged to her because her father was the wealthiest person in the country. He wanted money. Ann's friends caught Buchanan in some hanky-panky that wasn't with the lady. It's so shocking, she calls off the wedding, goes to Philadelphia. She committed suicide there. I found the attending physician's letters. And he said it's the only patient he ever treated who took her own life from hysteria. She is buried back in Lancaster. Buchanan's not there. He's on the run because Ann's father hired a vigilante squad to hunt his ass down and kill him. So Buchanan's on the run. So he makes up this whole story to hide his sexuality. When he's in the U.S. Senate, he has a male live-in lover for 10 years, a fellow senator. And I apologize for smiling. I've been a staunch advocate for same-sex equality my whole life. And I have to say it. Buchanan's male live-in lover was a senator from Alabama. So I'll tell everybody from Alabama. You've been to Alabama, you understand why. So at any rate, they were called Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan. Buchanan's nickname was Nancy Buchanan. Nancy in the 1800s was the equivalent to the derogatory term fag. So Nancy Buchanan. William Rufus King was his lover. He gets tuberculosis, goes to Havana for R&R and dies there. I led a tour to Havana on a cruise years ago when we could go, and his marker's still there, by the way. But at any rate, Buchanan writes a letter to a wealthy socialite named Mrs. Roosevelt, where in the letter he says, I've gone out a wooing and a courting for gentlemen again, but come up empty-handed. He goes, I think I'll live alone. I won't find a gentleman. Maybe I'll have to marry a woman, as long as she never, ever expects any physical intimacy. I mean, so there's letters in the record. He also was an ambassador in Europe, and he was touring a monastery, and this monk comes in, and he falls head over heels for this monk. When I read the letters, I had to light a cigarette. I don't smoke. opened a bottle of wine and put a little cologne. I made a night out of it. I'm a professor, that's about as good as it gets. So Buchanan writes in the letter when the monk came in, and of course his name can't be Brother Tim or Brother Fred or Brother Harry. It was Brother Antoine. And Buchanan writes that when he came in, the sun was shining through the stained glass window on his chestnut almond beard, and I said, "Be still, my heart." He said he approached me and took my cheeks in both hands, and his full lips met mine, and then he gave me a kiss on each cheek as the custom in Europe, and I said, "I surrender," and I collapsed into his arms. I mean, it's like a penthouse letter, I've been told, right? So anyway, so we'll end with this. That's Martha. So Mrs. Washington, looking like Betty Crocker meets Mrs. Santa Claus. Hybrid. Martha hated to have her painting done. She hated it. And she's always grumpy and all of that, and never likes sitting for it. She looks the same way in every painting. The problem is history has viewed Martha monolithically, unidimensionally, as this fuddy-duddy granny. But there's one letter of Martha's that has been published in books. And in the letter, Martha's asked to describe herself, and she says, quote unquote, "I'm an old-fashioned Virginia housekeeper, busy as a bee, steady as a clock, cheerful as a cricket." End quote. That's cute. But it doesn't reveal the real Martha. The real Martha was a badass. Martha visits George every winter of the war. I loved Cookie Roberts and her work, but in her book on Founding Mothers, she wrote Martha won 2 winters, every single winter. We have evidence. And that meant riding hundreds of miles, as I said, no GPS, open wagon through enemy territory. What did Martha do when she was in camp? She saved the army. Units named themselves Lady Washington's Dragoon. That's a mounted unit. Some people write the general was amazing, but then there was Mrs. Washington. Martha held soldiers' hands when they were dying, read the letters from their loved ones, helped them write letters, mended socks, sewed uniforms, told them stories at night, made them soup. She was famous for her soup. My guess would be matzo ball. We don't know, but I'm staying with that, okay? Matzo ball soup. Martha even imbued George Washington's sagging confidence. Hamilton, one winter of the war, wrote when Martha arrived. Historians love to quote Grant, Hamilton, and Truman, because those 3 guys were utterly incapable of lying. I mean, they wrote everything. I mean, even with mistakes they made. So we love to read them because they were as honest as the day is long. Wouldn't that be nice? So Hamilton writes when Martha arrived in camp, he writes, quote unquote, "Thank goodness Lady Washington has arrived in camp. The good general has been inconsolable. Now we can finally get back to the business of winning the war." Because Martha's there. Now, do not underestimate the importance of having a granny, a bubby, a yaya, a nona, and a abuela in camp with 19-year-olds that are scared to death, miss their moms, haven't been paid, are starving, and all of a sudden in walks Mrs. Santa Claus and holds your hand and brings in matzo ball soup, right? She was revered. Now, that's a different side of Martha. She was also humble. She once wrote of a 21-gun salute, she wrote, quote unquote, "It's as if I'm a very great somebody." She just dismissed it all. We have these letters from these 2 young girls that are going to a party in a winter camp during the war. And they're excited about going to the party. They sound like 2 girls getting ready for the prom. Because guess who's in camp? Colonel Hamilton. He was Brad Pitt, right? Meets Hugh Hefner. So the young girls can't wait to go and see him. They're writing back and forth. We have a letter from one of them to the other one after the party. They arrive at the party, the one goes straight to find Hamilton, as every young woman did. The other one goes to pay her respects to Martha. She can't find Martha at her own party. Martha's in a back room, sitting and sewing socks. The woman walks in, and she's shocked at this fuddy-duddy grandmother sitting there. Martha says, "Pull up a chair and get busy." We have an army to put in clothing. And the woman never got to meet Hamilton. We don't have a letter from the other one, but I can only imagine the way that went. So what we should do, when Martha was 17, she was widely courted, and yet she was middle upper class. She was courted by the leading men of Virginia aristocracy. She married at 17 a man who was 37 and the wealthiest man in all of Virginia. To give you some sense. What we know is when one man tried to court her at her father's home, back then you had asked permission, right? And the woman wouldn't be there. He rides up on horseback. The father comes out on the front porch and he's asking permission. Martha hears or sees, we don't know. What we know is she walks out on the front porch. He's on a horse. She tells him to bend down and smacks him across his face. If you're going to court me, you get off the horse. I like her. So what we do by showing these Betty Crocker images, instead of Martha at 17, it shows us a different picture of history. Enigmatic Mona Lisa, right? The Cheshire Cat, she knows something. She's confident, the posture, low cut dress for the times. It tells us something about Martha. And I'll end with that, that's good. So with that, let me just say, there's more we don't know than we know about history. And a big problem is today history has become politicized. And we see whether it's Spain under Franco or Salazar in Portugal or Hitler in Germany or Mussolini in Italy or Tojo in Japan in the 30s, we saw people that seized power and rewrote history. And we're doing that now in the United States. He who controls the present controls the past by rewriting it. And it's people that know shockingly little about history that are telling other people what to do, say, teach. And we're rewriting our history for political expediency. So we must be ever vigilant and make sure we don't lose the battle for the past, because that is a battle of who we are as a people and what kind of nation this is and will become. Thank you. Questions? All the way in the back, and I'll repeat it.
Oh, I can bring the microphone. You can speak loud.
Okay, so I mentioned three people that were honest. I mentioned Grant, Hamilton, and Truman. Hamilton was never president. The other Grant was our 18th. But I didn't mention Lincoln. I'm a huge Lincoln fan. He's one of my heroes, no question. He earned the nickname Honest Abe because when he was working at Joshua Speed's general store, he shortchanged the man by a couple of cents and walked miles after the end of work to give the man a couple of cents back. And the guy said, "You're honest, Abe," and it stuck. So Lincoln was honest, he was honorable, but Lincoln could also tell a tall tale, BS, and fib for political reasons. He was the consummate politician. For example, folks in the North, some people wanted to end slavery, others didn't. The question is, people were willing to go to war to keep the Union together. Many people never met someone who was of African descent, so they weren't willing to die to end slavery. So Lincoln wants to do it, but has to do it casually. He has to do it at the right time. So he gives this famous speech where he says to a newspaper then, and then he writes a letter to a prominent editor. He says, if I could keep the Union together by ending slavery, I would. And if I could keep the Union together by not ending slavery, I would. And if I could keep the Union together by ending slavery in some states, but not in others, I would. We clear? Well, that's kind of, I guess it's about union. After that, we know that Lincoln told his two aides, John Hay and John Nicholson, he says, I told them what they want to hear. Now let's go do the right thing. So Lincoln could BS with the best of them. So you can't read Lincoln and assume it's straightforward. He always had an angle. He was a consummate politician, although an honorable and great man, no question. Who else? Yes. How did the concept of slavery begin? So white Southerners did not have a corner on the market. This goes back to biblical times. Tragically, every culture, every civilization, every period in history has been scarred by human bondage. And people were willing to fight wars for it. Don't forget, Southerners were willing to shred the Constitution, attack the US, and send their boys to die in order to perpetuate slavery. And most of them didn't even own slaves. So talk about an irrational, horrific thing. And slavery in the US was not that long ago. I mean, this was just a few generations, a blink of the eye, right? So it's all around the world and it continues, just like we say, never again, never forget, right? And genocide continues to happen around the world. So we're still dealing with the horrors of slavery. It's as old as humanity. Yes, ma'am. How's Biden doing?
We're not doing politics.
I'd say like a B. I don't think he's a great president, but I think he's okay. I think he did 3 things well. I'll just mention, without getting into a laundry list and pissing everybody off, although I probably already did.